Chapter 7. Around the Campfire. Wait by the fire, Moll, and I'll fetch Oak. Mooshi's eyes had filled with tears again, but she brushed them away and stood up. It's time you two talked. Moll made her way towards the fire in the middle of the clearing, where Patty was scraping the last of the porridge into a bowl. She and her husband had been members of Oak's camp for as long as anyone could remember, and while their daughter Ivy was easily the most alluring young woman in the clearing, the same could not be said about their son Siddy, who combined a hopelessly misdirected enthusiasm with a very little common sense. And there was a baby too, but she spent most of her time eating soil and sticking twigs in her ears. Excepting Ivy, Patty had it hard. Today she was flaunting a purple waistcoat over a lilac blouse and a ruffled lavender skirt. Since the day she turned 30, Patty had refused to wear anything other than purple. Most of the time she looked like a giant bluebell, but she was the best hawker the camp had. Rumour had it that she had so much charm she could sell a toad for a small fortune. Moll perched on an upturned log, her thoughts whirling. Patty pulled the kettle back from the fire and passed Moll a steaming cup of raspberry leaf tea. Here, drink this, she smiled, and there's one bowl of porridge left. Moll poked a spoon into the porridge, but her mind was miles away. Why was Skull after her and Griff? She scoured the trees beyond the clearing for the wildcat and thought she glimpsed a movement of grey-black stripes. For a second, things felt just a tiny bit better. Moll ate a mouthful of porridge and looked across the fire. Folded into a threadbare armchair he'd taken 3 days to haul from his wagon and a further 3 weeks to stitch with the saying, "Sometimes I sits and thinks, sometimes I just sits," was Hard Times Bob, Oak's uncle and Cinderella Bull's brother, and he was doing what he did best in the mornings, taking a nap. Moll finished her porridge, then looked back up at Patty. "You elders know about Skull's DreamSnatch, don't you? That's what you speak about late at night round the fire. I've heard you." Patty looked about to deny it, but when she saw Moll's glare, she nodded. "You all knew and I didn't," Moll said. "Only the elders knew." Patty reached for a broom and began sweeping up scraps of food. "And that was because we needed to keep you safe. If we hadn't told you about the boundary, you'd have crossed into Skull's camp years ago. You and Siddy are always off exploring places." Moll knew Patty was probably right, but she said nothing. There was only one person she felt like talking to now, and as she glanced up at the rope swing on the other side of the clearing, Patty seemed to read her thoughts. Hands on hips, Patty stood up. "Oi, Siddy!" she shouted. "Over here, now! And take that ridiculous scrap of paper out of your mouth. Your father might smoke his tobacco after breakfast, but you're only 12 and you look ridiculous." Siddy charged into the feeding chickens, sending them flying into a nearby wagon. He only wanted one thing in life, to be like his father. Jess could tickle trout out of the river with his hands, and he smoked hand-rolled cigarettes. So Siddy had to make do with catching minnows in jam jars and stuffing bits of paper into his mouth. He'd even admitted to Moll that it tasted disgusting, but had said, "A man's got to do what a man's got to do." Moll had no idea what a man had got to do, but she was pretty sure Siddy wasn't doing it. Siddy made one more swing for Rocky Joe, then sidled back towards the fire. As he approached Moll, he dipped his flat cap just like his father always did. Patty sighed. "Your shirt needs a wash, your hair's all over the place, and your shorts are covered in mud. Have I taught you nothing?" Siddy beamed, which made his ears stick out even further. "You've taught me lots, Ma, but I haven't learnt anything." Patty clouted him round the head, but he only grinned harder. Then he looked Moll up and down, his paper cigarette still lodged between his lips. "You okay?" Moll didn't look up. She didn't need to. Not with Sid. Ever since they were small, Moll and Siddy had gone around together. From an early age it had been clear to everyone in the camp that Moll was going to be a terrible hawker. Her wire flowers were always slapdash. They looked more like wilting weeds than freshly picked chrysanthemums. And during her first outing selling her goods in the village, she had been so foul-tempered to customers who didn't want her flowers that Moushy and Patty had vowed never to take her again. But with Siddy, Moll could be herself. They shared a mutual love of finding stuff and doing stuff. Searching for woodpecker nests and building dens had bound them far closer than wire flowers could ever have done. Siddy looked from Moll to his ma. "What have you gone and said to her? You been giving her grief over spying on school? I heard she was only trying to get Jinx back." "I think you'd better take a seat, Sid," Patty said. Siddy plonked himself down onto the log next to Moll while Patty busied herself with the dirty pans on the other side of the fire. "It's school," Moll mumbled from behind her hair. He's after me and Griff." Siddy frowned. "You and Griff?" Moll nodded. "And now everything's dreadful." Siddy shook his head. "I don't understand. Tell me what you saw in the deep wood, Moll." He paused. "Tell me everything." And Moll did. But she left out one thing. Griff had touched her, and that was a secret she wasn't ready to share. Siddy blew out through his lips. "So Skull's got a DreamSnatch, and he's using it to summon you and Griff?" Moll sunk her head into her hands. "Yes, and I don't even know why, because Oak's out chopping logs, so all I can do is sit here and eat porridge until he comes back." She kicked the ground. "And now Florence and the others will find out and call me an outsider all over again." Siddy lowered his voice. "None of this changes anything, Moll. Oak's camp will always stand by you, no matter what you go around saying. You should know that by now." For a moment the knot inside Moll loosened, and then she thought of Skull squeezing the wax figure through his hands. "But I'm different from the others. Proper different. Not just my eyes and my beginning now." Siddy shrugged, pulling his pet earthworm Porridge II from his pocket. "Different's good. You just can't see it yet." He prodded his earthworm. "Isn't that right?" Porridge II only ever wore one expression, a sort of long-suffering look of indifference, but it satisfied Siddy, and he took an imaginary puff of his paper cigarette. Moll shook her head. "I shouldn't have let that boy in Skull's camp see me. Now Skull knows where I am." Her shoulders drooped. "Why do I always go and mess things up?" Patty swept a pile of scraps around the fire towards them. "It's what makes us real, Moll," she said. "There's a crack in everyone and everything, but that's how the light gets in." "Wish I didn't have so many cracks," Moll muttered. "I'm like a smashed up eggshell, me." "What's this, Moll?" came a voice as rough as sandpaper from the other side of the fire. "You planning another catapult attack on the chicken eggs with Siddy?" "Not this time," Moll said glumly. Hard Times Bob shot a glance at Patty, who just nodded. Then he let out a low whistle. "So you know about the DreamSnatch, eh?" He adjusted the snakeskin binding on his hand, Moushy's latest, somewhat questionable, cure for his arthritis. Moll and Siddy nodded. Hard Times Bob was an old man who had the posture of a tortoise, with skin as shriveled and stumps of black decaying teeth, despite the hedgehog paw he carried, which was meant to stave off toothache. But he could dislocate every bone in his body and fit through the rungs of a ladder, and that counted for more than shrivelled skin and stumpy teeth. Hard Times Bob yawned. "Not like me to be napping through things like this." Patty raised her eyebrows. "It's exactly like you, Bob." Hard Times Bob looked at Moll. "So Oak's told you all about the bone—" "That's enough, Bob." Patty threw him a warning look. "Oak's not back in the clearing yet. He's still to talk with Moll." Moll leapt up and rushed over to Hard Times Bob. "Tell me, Bob," she urged, kneeling by his armchair, "why is Skull after me and Griff?" For a moment Hard Times Bob's face looked torn, then it shut like a cupboard door. He looked over at Florence and another girl peeling potatoes on the steps of a wagon. "Why don't you and Siddy help the girls out with the feast preparations until Oak gets back?" Florence looked up from the potatoes and smiled, her auburn ringlets falling in perfect curls round her face. "I bet they'd appreciate your help." Moll stood up, ready to storm from the fire. Then Hard Times Bob winked. "Would it help if I dislocated anything, just until you speak to Oak?" Moll was in two minds, but when Siddy came bounding round the fire to see, she knew she didn't want to miss out. "Maybe your elbow," she mumbled. Hard Times Bob's arms disappeared into his waistcoat. His silver watch chain jiggled, and after several seconds of wriggling and wheezing he held up a very floppy arm. And then his hiccups started. He'd had them for nearly 30 years now, but they were always worse after a dislocation. Despite everything, Moll smiled. Patty bustled round and patted him on the back. "You're not remembering to cross your boots before bed, are you? Prevents cramps and hiccups. You should know that by now." Hard Times Bob rolled his eyes. "You think you've got it hard, Moll." But Moll was no longer listening. Oak was back in the clearing, laying down a pile of logs before the Bender tent. His shirt was browned from the bark and his neckerchief flecked with wood chippings. Moll watched as Mooshie arranged the logs into a stack and Oak made his way towards the fire. The camp clattered on. Chickens screeched, a greyhound barked, and children laughed. But those gathered round the fire were silent. Oak stood before them, his hands in his pockets. "Come on, Moll. Let's walk to the glade." Moll held his gaze. Oak had taught her the ways of the forest when she was little, and he'd showed her how to carve catapults and animals from the trees. But as she looked at him now, she felt that old familiar world sliding away. She'd trusted Oak and Mooshie, but they'd been keeping secrets from her. And she had a horrible feeling that the dream snatch was just the beginning.